That sound you can hear is the engine of my 1993 Ford Falcon XG Ute. And in this episode, we're taking it on a road trip around Australia. Hello and welcome to Track Changes. I'm Murray Griffin of Consultancy Earthed. Anyone who knows me might be surprised I own a classic ute. And I admit, if someone asked to see the engine, it might take me a while to find the hood release. But I like driving it around. And something else I really like is looking under the hood at what state and territory governments are doing to see what climate and sustainability laws and policies they're introducing, or unfortunately in some cases, to find out what climate and sustainability laws and policies they're removing. All right, get set for a speedy trip around the nation, meeting a few colourful characters along the way. And we're starting in Queensland, which is a fair distance, so I'll put the radio on for some music to help pass the time. Okay, here we are in downtown Brisbane. The Conservative LNP government has now been in power in Queensland for just over 7 months. And I think if I had to come up with a phrase to describe the state of law and policy in Queensland under the LNP, it would be this: a future delayed in Australia. Because while the federal government has an overarching strategy of a future made in Australia, involving building the industries of the future, Queensland's Conservative LNP government is in some ways going backwards. It's racing to make it easier to extract and sell fossil gas and coal, and simultaneously it's making it harder for renewables projects to get off the ground. One example of this is a government direction to its advisory Queensland Productivity Commission. The direction instructs the Commission to provide advice on the state's energy and emissions settings. But the direction seems to take it as a given that the government will repeal the state's renewable energy targets. The Commission will report by the 1st of September, and its findings will feed into a new 5-year energy roadmap that the state government will release by the end of the year. I wouldn't be getting you hopes up about what the roadmap might look like, though. I think of it this way: while other states are using GPS to find their way on energy, I'm concerned that Queensland might be going to use the kind of old-fashioned paper map I've got sitting on the back shelf of the ute. Another example of the Queensland government's actions to slow the shift to clean energy is a new law passed by Parliament in late June that will make it much harder to get a large-scale renewable energy project assessed, let alone get it approved. The bill requires renewable energy developers to finalise cost-benefit agreements with councils before they even lodge an application to undergo environmental assessment. That's instead of the far more sensible approach of allowing these agreements to be finalised during the assessment process and before approval is granted. It's a far tougher hurdle than the state government imposes on fossil fuel projects. And it isn't just the renewable sector that's worried about it. Quite a few councils are unenthusiastic about it as well. And while the Queensland government is making it harder for renewable energy projects, it's taking the opposite approach with the fossil fuel industry. It's created a special cabinet-level resources committee that has come up with proposals to cut delays in getting gas and coal projects approved. Those proposals haven't been made public yet, but we do know that they've been shared in detail with the gas and coal industry. One more example of the Queensland government's backward approach is the state's draft waste strategy, which is currently out for consultation. Although the waste sector is a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions, the draft strategy makes no mention of climate change or of the waste industry's potential to help reduce carbon emissions. Leaving aside climate change, other recent developments in Queensland, some of which are positive, include the government's release of proposed changes to the state's Environmental Protection Act. The changes would give courts more powers to order environmental criminals to forfeit property and money that they've acquired as a result of their environmental crimes. That's an excellent move. One more thing, a significant development in Queensland outside of government is the launch of legal proceedings by the Queensland Conservation Council, which is seeking to have the Land Court refuse an application to extend the life of an existing coal mine by another 20 years. The Conservation Council is alleging that the proposal fails to appropriately deal with the environmental impacts of the project, including its greenhouse gas emissions. Now, before we head to New South Wales, I know what we've found out about Queensland so far has been a bit of a downer, which is not a great start to our trip. But there's some exciting things happening in Queensland as well. Lizzie Webb is the Chief Executive of The Next Economy, an organisation that works with communities, industries and governments, looking at how regional communities can shape their own destinies as Australia decarbonises. Lizzie has been involved in some exciting new work in Mount Isa, so let's hear all about it. Hello, Lizzie.
Hi, Murray. How are you?
Good, good. Tell me a bit about The Next Economy.
Well, The Next Economy is an economic development agency, and we work with leaders right across Australia in government, industry, investment, and community organisations to create the conditions for a rapid, responsible, and a fair transition to a climate-safe, regenerative, and socially just Australian economy. So, in other words, we're working with some of the regions that are most impacted by climate change, decarbonisation, and changes in our economy to support them to find their way through in ways that benefit people and the environment.
Sounds very exciting. And you, in fact, have recently completed a particularly exciting project, which is a roadmap for Mount Isa in Queensland. Can you tell me a bit about that
Yes.
process and what it delivered?
Certainly. I might start with a little bit of context, Murray. Mount Isa, like many industrial regions in Australia, is at a crossroads of major economic change. So the region's got a very rich asset base. It's part of the Northwest Minerals Province, but it's right now navigating the closure of the Mount Isa mine's underground copper mine operations and copper concentrator. So this big change to their economy has really highlighted the need for them to take immediate action to sustain their workforce, to diversify and attract new business, and to also invest in essential community infrastructure there. So Mount Isa City Council approached The Next Economy to support them and their stakeholders across the region to develop a roadmap that articulates their vision for the future. So we started working with Council in late 2023, along with our partners Climate Click Australia. And over the course of a 12-month period, we undertook a significant review of existing plans and strategies for the region, and then engaged deeply with stakeholders across industry, government, and the community sector to understand what opportunities they see for the region and what sorts of barriers are there that need to be addressed. So the roadmap really brings together the region's vision for the future, for both the medium and the long term. And it looks at pathways, strategies, and actions for the region to take across 5 key sectors of the economy, being energy, mining, transport, agriculture, and tourism. And I think what's really important about this piece of work and the roadmap is that it has an incredibly strong focus on the kind of economy that Mount Isa will need for the future, with a very strong emphasis on decarbonisation and adaptation to a changing climate, as well as investment into the community infrastructure so that that people can truly thrive.
Okay, so tell me about some of the, I guess, focus points of that roadmap.
So something that Mount Isa City Council was very keen to emphasise from the outset is that they've got a strong history of innovation, particularly in mining processes and technology, and they want to bring that through into the future of the economy. So actually, while the roadmap was being developed, Mount Isa City Council led a number of new collaborations that I think are particularly exciting. And just to give you an example, they've signed a memorandum with an organisation called Green Gravity that's actually looking at the repurposing of mine shafts in Mount Isa for gravitational energy storage. Now, that's really critical because there's an aspiration in the region to significantly implement renewable energy projects. That, of course, is going to need substantial storage as well. So they're looking to position the region as a leader in new technology and process. And I think that's an excellent example that very much aligns with decarbonisation.
That is, I'm going to ask you to explain what was it gravity energy storage?
Gravitational
Grav
energy storage, yes.
Gravitational. What is that? I mean, I'm
Well,
impressed without even knowing, but
essentially, large weights are lowered down within the mine shafts and then raised again. And so basically, energy that's generated through solar, for example, during the day when the sun's shining, is then converted into a form of kinetic energy. So the energy then can be released. It is basically stored through the form of the weights and then is released when it's required, which might be during the night, for example.
terrific.
I'm very happy to share more information with you on that system. It's really quite clever, and the best bit is it's about repurposing of existing infrastructure.
It is impressive. I mean, I've always been impressed. I remember somebody telling me once, that holes in the ground are very valuable, and what they were talking about was quarries, which were then repurposed as a form of sort of landfill. So, but what you're talking about is in fact next level. But I wanted to ask you next about something which is not below ground; it's well and truly above ground, and which I
Mm.
personally am very excited about, which is airships. Now, I'm amazed.
Yes.
I am amazed that Mount Isa's future could include airships. But talk us through that.
Certainly. So, Mount Isa City Council is looking to collaborate with a French Canadian company who've developed the concept of flying whales. So they're a 200-meter helium lift airship, and they can transport very heavy loads of up to 60 tons with very low emissions. Now, this is important because the airships are designed to transport heavy, bulky items like wind turbines. And there's a growing body of evidence that the transport of wind turbines can be problematic in terms of road infrastructure. So the airships are advantageous where roads or bridges can't facilitate access or the load is too heavy. And of course, there's very large distances associated with some of the locations of renewable energy projects, just as an example, up in the far northwest there. So Mount Isa City Council has signed an MOU with Flying Whales, and the idea is that the first Australian base will be constructed in Mount Isa. And I know that Mount Isa has been identified as an advantageous location because it's got very predictable weather. It's close to the mine sites up that way. And there's certainly a very strong aspiration for renewable energy development up that way too.
I love everything about that technology, and I also love its name, Flying Whales. And maybe next time I do a road trip around Australia, I'll be able to do it in a flying whale rather than a battered old ute. But
Maybe.
yeah, uh,
It's possible. And I think, Mary, what's important though is that these kinds of projects, Green Gravity and the Flying Whales Initiative, just show the aspiration in the region to think differently about what's possible, and to explore new types of collaborations that can really benefit the region.
yeah, that's wonderful. Those are both very exciting projects. Now, speaking of exciting projects, there is this
Yes.
project called Copper String, which is a massive
Yes.
transmission project that would, I think, pass through or start at Mount Isa. I'm not sure. Can you tell us a bit about what Copper String is, how it could fit into Mount Isa's future, and what sort of government support the project is getting?
Certainly. So Copper String is a high voltage transmission line project that will run east-west all the way from the coast in the Townsville area all the way out to Mount Isa. And it's absolutely key because it will connect that whole northwest region with the national energy market. Now, what that can mean for the region is a reduction in energy prices. It could significantly incentivise renewable energy development across the region. They're also hoping that the project will stabilise the grid in the northwest and really help unlock the region's potential to contribute to the national energy market. So it is very significant for the region. Our understanding is that the new Queensland government is supportive of the project and appreciates its potential for the economic development of the region. We understand that they're continuing to seek private investment to deliver copper string all the way across to that northwest area near Mount Isa.
Well, Lizzie, those are all very exciting developments. Thanks very much for chatting to us. And I guess it's time for me to hit the road.
Thanks, Murray. We'll drive safe, and I encourage you to visit Mount Isa as part of your journey if you can.
Thanks very much, Lizzie. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, it's time to get back into the climate change and sustainability classic ute because we're heading over the border to New South Wales. Here we are in Sydney, which is home to the largest population of one of Australia's most threatened species. I'm referring to Liberal Party figures who recognise that climate change is an existential threat that requires rapid, ambitious action. These brave figures in the Liberal Party have been reduced to isolated pockets federally, as well as in other states, where they have been driven out of their habitat by the notoriously aggressive, noisy miners and their mates in the Murdoch media. But in Sydney, people such as Matt Keane, Rob Stokes and Malcolm Turnbull are still very influential. And that mindset shows in the high level of cooperation we see in the New South Wales Parliament on climate and environment matters. And that cooperation in turn means that important things get done quickly. The most significant bill to go through the New South Wales Parliament in recent months is a circular economy bill called the Product Lifecycle Responsibility Bill, which paves the way for the state to introduce mandatory product stewardship schemes that include requirements about product and packaging design, manufacturing and reuse, as well as recycling and disposal. The new law, which went through the New South Wales Parliament in just 10 days, also gives the minister the ability to set stewardship targets for regulated products. And it gives the minister the power to require producers to prepare action plans outlining how they will meet the targets to ensure that their products are designed, manufactured, used and disposed of in a responsible manner. The first product to be targeted will be small lithium batteries, which, as we all know, are a fire hazard and are also extremely dangerous if ingested by children. There actually is a fairly new voluntary national stewardship scheme for batteries, but it's pretty hopeless, and even its supporters say its existing financial structure isn't workable. The New South Wales product stewardship legislation, on the other hand, is a terrific piece of environmental law, and it would be great to see similar legislation picked up federally, as the federal Greens have recommended, or at least to see it picked up in other states. In other developments, the New South Wales EPA is consulting on proposed changes to the state's energy from waste framework. Energy from waste facilities are currently banned in New South Wales unless they're established in one of 4 specified regional precincts. The trouble is, those precincts aren't where waste companies would like to build energy from waste facilities. As a result, the New South Wales government has released a discussion paper that proposes amending the list of acceptable precincts for energy from waste projects to match the sites where waste and recycling companies want to build them. The proposed changes would also give the New South Wales EPA the power to allow, on a case-by-case basis, waste-to-energy projects in any location where the energy they produce would replace fossil gas. Incidentally, there's a good example of that substitution for fossil gas occurring in Victoria, where paper manufacturer Opal will slash fossil gas use at its Maryvale paper mill by commissioning an energy from waste facility, which will reduce the mill's greenhouse gas emissions by about 270,000 tonnes a year and save the company money. Meanwhile, on the climate change front, the New South Wales government has also issued a very impressive response to a New South Wales parliamentary inquiry into net zero. In its response to the inquiry, the government signalled that it will develop a new statewide net zero plan that will cover all sectors, but with a strong focus on transport and the built environment. The new plan will target those sectors because they matter a lot. Transport is the second highest emitting sector in New South Wales, and it has been a growing source of emissions since 2005. And emissions associated with building construction and use have doubled in the state since 2005. The government's response to the net zero inquiry also says that the EPA will release a range of sector-specific guidance on emissions reduction and climate risk reduction. And the first cab off the rank will be a mitigation guide for the coal sector. And importantly, and I'm very excited about this, the EPA will soon start placing climate change conditions or emissions reduction conditions in the environment protection licenses that it issues to companies. This is a big deal because Australia's EPAs can potentially play a major role in helping and directing businesses to cut emissions, but they generally haven't used those powers up till now. That's starting to change, and the New South Wales EPA is the first state agency to step up and start to exercise those powers. Meanwhile, the New South Wales government is also planning to establish a regional monitoring network for greenhouse gases, starting in the Hunter region, which is a major coal mining region. It also plans to develop climate change adaptation regulations covering risk assessment, adaptation planning, and monitoring. There are another 6 recent developments in New South Wales that it's worth briefly noting. Firstly, there's the release of the latest State of the Environment report, which says vegetation cover has declined in the state so much that the ability of New South Wales remaining habitats to support native plants, animals and ecosystems has dropped to just 29% of their pre-industrialisation capacity. Secondly, the EPA has released a draft waste and circular infrastructure plan. Thirdly, the state government has granted access rights for 10 proposed renewable energy projects to connect to its Central West Arana Renewable Energy Zone. The 10 projects have a total of more than 7 gigawatts of renewable energy and storage capacity, and they comprise 3 wind farms, 4 solar farms, and 3 standalone battery projects. Fourthly, a parliamentary committee inquiry into modern slavery risks in regional New South Wales has started conducting public hearings. Fifthly, another parliamentary committee inquiry, this one into the community impact of renewable energy zones, has also started public hearings. And lastly, the Office of the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner has released the first of 3 reports on modern slavery risks in the procurement of electric vehicles by New South Wales government agencies. And now it's time to head to Victoria. Let's get back in the Climate Change and Sustainability Classic Ute, and I'll put the radio on while we head south. As we head down the highway to Melbourne, here's a little known fact about Victoria. The state is home to the largest pie factory in the world. Yes, Patty's Pies in Lakes Entrance, which also makes the 4 and 20 pie, and the Herbert Adams pie is the largest pie factory in the world. That means the factory probably uses a lot of fossil gas, as does a lot of Victorian industry and many Victorian homes. In fact, Victoria is Australia's largest consumer of fossil gas, with more than 2 million homes and businesses connected to the gas network. That's a problem for two reasons. Firstly, burning fossil gas results in greenhouse gas emissions that heat the planet. And secondly, for households and quite a few businesses, relying on fossil gas for heating, hot water and cooking is very expensive. It's actually much cheaper to use electricity and electrical appliances. Economists have calculated that the average Victorian household that has both gas and electric appliances could reduce their annual energy bill by around $1,700 by going all electric. Luckily for Victorian households and businesses, the state government has done a rather brilliant job in the last few weeks of coming up with a package to break up with fossil gas, or at least to reduce the state's reliance on it. And I'm just going to pull up over here so we can hear more about those gas changes from Jarrod Leak, who is an energy expert and who heads up the Australian Alliance for Energy Productivity. Hello, Jarrod.
Hello, Murray. First comment, nice you to what have you got there?
It's a 1993 Ford XG Classic Ute, Jarrod. Okay, well, thanks, Jarrod. Now, you're an energy expert. Tell us about the Victorian government's new announcements on gas and what differences the changes will make to businesses and homes.
Yeah, so Victorian government has taken the step after some consultation of banning gas connections for new homes and new buildings. At the same time, also ensuring that rental properties get proper upgrades to electrification as well. This has been a fairly comprehensive consultation they've had on that. It wasn't absolutely unanimous. This is a great way to go. They had looked at a lot of options. But I think it's a really smart decision. And I think all good laws and decisions are already based on what most people are doing anyway. And that's the reality of commercial buildings for sure, and increasingly residential buildings already, where that's just the standard. All the new ones being developed now, and the specifications for the last couple of years have pretty much all been electrification solutions.
So, what would your message be to businesses and homeowners that are contemplating what option they have to reduce their use of fossil gas, and that are wondering about the costs of making changes?
Yeah, so the change, if you looked at this 2 or 3 years ago and you went out to your builder and said, I want to electrify, you would have got a bit of pushback, and certainly my friends experienced this as well. But those asking those questions about heat pumps and electric solutions has got builders to level up and get ready for this as well. So it's been coming. And so you'll get the right support if you're right from the builders, and also then you're saving money. This is what it comes down to. It's going to be the right financial decision for your new home and new building. When you electrify with a heat pump, you're getting a device which is 5 or 6 times more efficient than the gas system you had beforehand. So this has a really good impact on your own bills and emissions as well. Not to mention the health issues. Less gas being burnt inside the home, less particulate matter, and what have you. So much better for health outcomes as well.
Now, I know you do a lot of case studies, a lot of webinars and so on, case studies of businesses and how they've reduced their energy bills and cut the use of fossil gas. Tell me one or two of your favourite examples.
Yeah, so there's a lot happening now. It's really ramped up from, if you went back 2 or 3 years, we sort of saw one heat pump project go ahead as almost an anomaly. But now there's so many electrification and heat pump projects happening every other month. We're hearing about a new one. A few favourites is wind. It's integrated with an existing system. So on the industrial side of things, we're seeing more heat pumps being integrated with a refrigeration plant. A refrigeration plant often has waste heat coming off that. And so if you capture that waste heat, use it and upgrade it with, say, with a heat pump, you're going to have a really good outcome there. When it comes to commercial buildings, the best projects we've seen, probably universities leading the way at the moment. Monash University, RMIT, where they're actually really taking a really good approach to, first of all, reduce their demand. So, we're going to do energy efficiency first, and that's things like air locks, so we're not losing nice warm air out of the building. But importantly, what they're doing is they're adjusting the way that their buildings operate. The building was designed to have, say, 80-degree hot water running through that to heat up the building. They know that that's really bad for a heat pump at 80 degrees on most of them. So they've done systems and programs to get that temperature down to sort of below 70. The really good ones have got it down to sort of 60 degrees, and you see improvements in heat pump efficiency by 20 or 30% by doing just that. So yeah, there's great projects happening, commercial and industrial, that's for sure.
So there's plenty of material out there, including via the A2EP website for companies that want to research how to cut their energy bills. Back to the Victorian government now, and the state government. The state government's work to reduce fossil gas use isn't done, is it? It isn't over, because it's gotten a plan for an industrial renewable gas certificate scheme, which would encourage industry to switch from fossil gas to biomethane and green hydrogen. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Murray, just before we get on to renewable gas and move on to electrification, one more thing to mention that's happening in Victoria, and that's this round 3 funding of the Energy Innovation Fund. There's $10 million available for that, and they're designing who and how that's going to be rolled out now, hopefully for deployment late this year, early next year. And so we're hoping that'll see 10 to 20 sites get support for their electrification project and get them off gas.
Yep.
So that's an excellent program from the Victorian government. And so that's electrification, and so plenty happening there. Now for the renewable gas. There's a lot of industries which will be very difficult to get off gas. And so they are going to need this biomethane or renewable gas that this new legislation will enable. Those are the industries very high temperature, so things like glass and cement. And for them to electrify, the technology is not available at the moment. No one else is really doing it. And or maybe that grid augmentation costs are really excessive to do so. So we are going to see quite a few industries and sites that say, just look, getting off gas and electrification is not for us, certainly not in the next 5 to 10 years. So give us some time and give us something to get us through. And that's likely to be renewable gas. I will say, however, there's more work to be done. Definitely more work to be done here. The regulations right now are not set up to enable new renewable gas producers. There's still too many barriers. There's still too many unknowns, and it's 2 or 3 years and somewhere around about $1 million to get everything through with the planning. If you go overseas, you look at Germany and Austria have some great new frameworks for bringing on new renewable gas projects. Yeah, you're talking in a couple of $100,000 to get this stuff happening. So there's a lot of work to do there to build up the regulations and the research behind that as well.
Terrific. Okay, Jarrod, thanks very much.
All the best on your travels around Australia, Murray. Great to chat with you.
Thanks, Jarrod. So that's Jarrod's take on Victoria's gas changes, and he's a total expert on what it means for homes and businesses. And who knows, maybe Paddy's Pies will be one of the companies that applies for a grant under that scheme that Jarrod mentioned. In other Victorian climate news, a landmark development that took effect on the 1st of July involved the Victorian State Electricity Commission, which now has contracts in place for all the state's schools, hospitals, trams, trains and other state government operations to be powered by 100% renewables. It's an amazing achievement, and those contracts that are being administered by the SEC will account for about 5% of the state's electricity market. While we're on the subject of climate change, I think it's worth pointing out that the state Conservative opposition has played quite an obstructionist role on climate-related legislation and policies. For example, the Victorian opposition voted against a recent government energy efficiency bill, and it has also pledged to abolish the State Electricity Commission. It also opposes a streamlined approval process for renewable energy projects, even though it doesn't object to the same streamlined process being available to gas, farming, housing, and mining projects. Personally, I think those positions and voting patterns by the Victorian opposition send a strong signal that if the opposition were to win the next Victorian state election, they would be much more like the Queensland LNP government on energy matters, rather than the New South Wales Liberals. Meanwhile, on the waste front, a new report from Victoria's Auditor General says state agencies have made, quote, considerable progress in building the state's capacity to recover and reprocess waste. But it's not all good news. The audit report also says the state is not on track to deliver its target of diverting 80% of waste from landfill by 2030. Partly for that reason, and as is occurring in New South Wales, Victoria is having a bit of a rethink on waste to energy. The Victorian government has released a regulatory impact assessment for proposed waste to energy regulations that would raise the state's existing cap on the amount of waste that can be processed by waste to energy facilities. There are another 4 recent developments in Victoria that it's worth briefly noting. Firstly, the government secured passage of legislation that extends the life of the state's energy efficiency subsidy program, which is known as the Victorian Energy Upgrade Program. The Victorian government has also announced that home ceiling insulation will be subsidised through the program from early next year. That's a very positive development that will significantly reduce the cost of getting homes insulated. And that, in turn, will cut the energy bills of a lot of households. Secondly, the Victorian government has released a draft state transmission plan that shows the proposed locations for 7 new renewable energy zones, as well as new transmission zones to service them. That draft plan starts to inject an important element of certainty into the state's energy transition planning. Thirdly, and personally, I'm really interested in this one. Victoria's water utilities are on track to get approval from the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission to club together to purchase carbon credits, which will make it easier and cheaper for those water utilities to buy them. It will be the first time that the ACCC has approved a carbon credits bulk buy. And once Victoria's water utilities do get approval to club together to buy credits, you can expect to see a lot more projects in Victoria that earn carbon credits through environmental plantings of biodiverse native vegetation. And lastly, the Victorian government has tweaked Solar Victoria's subsidy arrangements so that customers who choose an Australian-made heat pump will get a larger rebate. Okay, now it's time to head to South Australia and Adelaide's Parliament House, where we've got a VIP chat lined up. So buckle up. Here we are in Adelaide, and I'm very excited about developments in South Australia, and in particular the passage of the state's new Biodiversity Act, which includes a new general duty not to cause harm to biodiversity. And I'm also very excited because we're going to hear about the new law and some other important developments in South Australia from the state's Deputy Premier, Susan Close, who is also the state's Climate, Environment and Water Minister. The ute safely parked and locked up, so let's go hear what she has to say. It's good to be here in Adelaide with you, Minister. And just before we get into recent developments, can I start by asking you about Adelaide's potential role next year as the host city of UN climate talks? Can you tell us what are Adelaide's strengths as a potential host of those talks?
Sure thing. And of course, we are gearing up ready to host COP because we've been chosen, should Australia get it, to be the place that Australia will host it. But we still don't know whether it will be Australia or Turkey. So we're just having to work hard as if it's happening, because otherwise we'll be leaving it too late to get it organised.
Yes.
I think the biggest strength that we have that we'd like to showcase for people is our renewable electricity profile. So we lead the world in the generation of electricity from wind and sun, so intermittent sources. We're at over 75% of our electricity production will be net 100% by 2027, according to AEMO. So we feel that we have something to offer, because obviously intermittent renewable sources are difficult. They can be unstable. You need to do a lot of work on your grid and on stabilisation and firming. And so I think we've got something to offer. I'd also like to think that we can showcase the way in which we're increasingly better at caring for nature, because obviously while emissions reduction is of overwhelming importance, we also need to acknowledge that climate change is happening. We're experiencing it right now. And the stronger and more resilient nature is, the better we're able to withstand the crises that are occurring more and more frequently.
That is absolutely true. And on the subject of nature, you have just steered through Parliament a new Biodiversity Act. So can you tell me a bit about that legislation and what features in it you think are the most significant?
I'm really proud that we were able to bring this Biodiversity Act into Parliament and now through Parliament in South Australia. It's something that I'd put into our election commitments 4 years ago while we were in opposition, and I knew that there was a gap that needed to be filled, but I was really keen for the experts in the department, for scientists and for all of the people who are engaged in the environment, whether to protect it or as part of their business, to be part of building up what this piece of legislation will do. And what we have is a piece of legislation that builds on existing. So we've taken into this Biodiversity Act the entirety of the Native Vegetation Act, which stops clearance of native vegetation in South Australia, and the wildlife part of the National Parks and Wildlife Act, which is about the designation of threatened and vulnerable species and how species are to be protected individually. And we've made of that a much stronger collection of protections, existing protections for nature that's here right now, so that future decisions are made much more wisely and more protection for nature. But importantly also that we've brought in a legislative architecture to encourage and facilitate the restoration of nature, because it's no longer sufficient for us to think that if we just make better decisions in the future that we'll be able to continue to protect nature, because nature's really taken a hammering under the way it was treated early on in the creation of modern Australia, with climate change increasingly bearing down. So that restoration part is really important. And for that, we brought Ken Henry over, who's
Oh, really?
yes, wonderful, wonderful man. I don't know if you've had a chance to speak to him about these issues, but such a good leader.
I haven't, but I mean, he, of course, played a critical role in reshaping New South Wales biodiversity legislation, I think, last year. So,
Yes, he reviewed the legislation, and it was a pretty critical review, and I read it with very great interest, and we've made sure in creating our legislation that we're doing all the things that Ken Henry said biodiversity legislation ought to do. But we also brought him over and had him come and talk to our cabinet and explain the economic case for continuing to protect, but also to invest in restoration of nature, and just how much money there is waiting for the right place to invest. There's big corporates around the world that are looking to get the ESG credentials. There's businesses in South Australia, particularly primary production, that need to be able to demonstrate that they are nature positive in order to engage in selling to Europe or just selling to young people, frankly. And also there's philanthropic money around the world that's just waiting to have the big payoff for biodiversity. biodiversity. So we're expecting through this legislation to do better protection, more sensible decisions, greater reliance on science, better integration of First Nations knowledge, and then also making sure that we're creating this environment where nature positive becomes something that's easy to invest in, and South Australia is the place to do it.
It was interesting. I remember your release. I can't remember the exact quote, but I was really pleased to see your quote in that release about the new law, which talked about it from an ESG perspective and how it would make a creative framework that was, I guess, useful for business wanting to invest in nature or demonstrate its nature credentials.
So I just think we're in this environment now where business is looking for ways to make sure that they've got a sustainable future as a business. And finally, that means looking after nature as well. And so we just need to make that easy for business to engage in.
Yes, and you do have a new general duty in there not to cause harm to biodiversity, which is good to see as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's right. So it's everybody's obligation to
Yes.
do the right thing by nature, and so we've put that into the ledge. Yeah.
Okay, just two more questions on that bill. I did scan the parliamentary debates on this bill, and I was amazed by your mastery of every detail of it because it's quite a substantial bill. What's it like when you steer something this big through Parliament? You must feel a tremendous sense of achievement.
I know that when I look back on my career, this will be one of the highlights that I bore grandchildren with. That this is something that I believe will be glad increasingly over the years that we've got this kind of legislation, and that I had a part to play. Now, so did many people, but it was a genuine joy to steer it through Parliament. And my good friend Kyan Ma, who is the leader of the upper house for us and the Attorney General and Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, he did it in the other house. And I think we both felt a sense of achievement. There was a lot of detail. There were lots of questions about how this is going to work and so on. The integration, I think, of Aboriginal knowledge in particular was a little bit challenging for some of the members of Parliament. They really wanted to understand how that would work, but so worth it, and the expertise we have in our department is exceptional. So I was really well supported.
Yes, well, congratulations on steering it through. And I did want to ask you, because, South Australia has now passed this Biodiversity Act. As we were talking about, New South Wales has a similar law that went through last year on biodiversity. And it sort of begs the question, if New South Wales and South Australia can get this done, can overhaul nature and biodiversity protection legislation, why do you think it is proving so hard for the federal government to overhaul the federal equivalent law, which is known as the EPBC Act?
Yeah, I am very hopeful that this term of Parliament will see that come through. We stand ready to be supportive in every way. Initially, when we were drafting up this Act, we thought that maybe we wouldn't have to do some bits because that would be done federally. And we realised that we were probably better off putting it in our legislation, and we can always turn off bits if needed. But it's tough. Canberra politics are really tough. The terms are very short, and they had just come off 9 years of the Morrison et al. Government. And that, I think, was pretty challenging for it's a very quick turnaround from an environment that was pretty hostile to the kinds of issues that we're talking about. In South Australia, we've got pretty good legislation already, and it really was a case of bringing them together and making something that was greater than the sum of the parts. So I don't know. We stand ready to help our federal colleagues. I'm hopeful that this term will see some reforms, but it's important that states also take their responsibilities and that we do all that we can.
Yeah. Just one more thing on biodiversity. The work isn't completely done and dusted yet, though, is it? I mean,
it isn't.
You've got the requirement, in particular, for the development of a new significant environmental benefit policy to ensure that biodiversity offsets genuinely compensate for nature impacts and loss and leave biodiversity in a better state. How's work progressing on that?
That's right. So we've probably got 2 years' worth of getting all of the subordinate legislation, policy and guidelines together to make this Act really come to life. And that is going to take a lot of effort. It's terrific. We've had some very good budgets in the last 4 budgets now. for the environment. We've been able to get some more resources, but specifically into science and biodiversity. But it does take an effort. There are a few things in there that are really exciting. One is the establishment of the Biodiversity Council and subordinate committees such as the Scientific Committee and Aboriginal Biodiversity Committee. I want to turn those parts of the legislation on really quickly because they will guide the development of, for example, as you mentioned, the significant environmental offset policy. We've long had the mantra of SEB, significant environmental benefit, the idea that if you're going to remove anything, you need to show that it's not just a replacement but better than. But the policy hasn't really been particularly helpful or, in fact, easy for people to use who want to do the right thing, let alone tough enough to make sure that we're getting that benefit. So that's going to be a very big focus of that council early on. Also, the other one I'm very excited about is the State Biodiversity Plan, because that plan will carry within it the priorities for restoration, so that when I've got a series of grants for environment groups, for example, we can reference back to that prioritisation so that money that was going to be spent anyway can be done with the knowledge of what priorities look like for restoration of nature. So I'm very excited about that one. Really excited, although it will be no doubt challenging, for the significant environmental benefit policy. And all of that will be guided by this great group of people that will get around the table for the council and its committees.
Terrific. Okay, well, we'll look forward to seeing how that all unfolds. Moving along now, and can I ask you about the statutory climate change policy that the South Australian EPA is developing? How far advanced is work on that policy, and what exactly will it do?
So just to situate that a little bit in a couple of legislative reforms that we did before the Biodiversity Act, first of all, we changed the Environmental Protection Act to explicitly acknowledge that climate change is part of its considerations as a regulatory body. We've also updated our Climate Change Act, which I think was the first one in Australia back in 2007, and we've put in tougher targets for emissions reduction. We've also put in requirements for government to address adaptation and risk management policies. And between the two of those, for the EPA, the Environment Protection Authority, what that means is that the EPA, when dealing with businesses that are emitters and or businesses that are very vulnerable to climate change, will have policy guidance and will have expertise from the EPA to help them. In terms of the policy, they've been building the team, so we had to get budget allocation in order to be able to build the team of experts. We've done that. We've started the drafting. I would expect that policy to be at least publicly aired before the end of the year to help guide for businesses who are engaged and obviously both at risk and in producing emissions, and also for policymakers more generally, that this is where the EPA is positioning emissions and climate risk in its suite of regulatory tools. So we'll probably, let's have another podcast when we've got that out and we can talk about the detail.
Yeah, indeed. Well, it has always amazed me that EPAs around Australia would seem to have so much potential to tap, I guess, that middle layer. You're not necessarily the very large emitters, but the sort of mid-tier emitters, and to help them along the way. South Australia and New South Wales are proving to be the first movers in terms of bringing their EPAs into play to tackle climate change through their EPA environmental licensing regimes. Do you expect other states to follow suit?
I absolutely do. And in fact, the legal advice we had was that it was almost certainly the case that the EPA was, within the current legislation, responsible for bringing in the question of emissions and risk management. But what we wanted to do is put that beyond doubt, and also by creating the legislation, create a bit more emphasis on that, which is sorely needed. So I suspect that's probably true of other states, that if there were to be some sort of court case, that it might well be that they would find that they were already responsible. But in any case, climate change is the overwhelming shaping issue for all of us. And the more instruments we can bring to bear to deal with it, the better. And so I can't imagine that other states won't come on board.
Terrific. Okay, and finally, if I could ask you just about the new waste and circular economy policy that's out for public comment in South Australia at the moment. How different is it from previous state waste policies?
We are getting to that challenging point now where we've got really good recycling. We're the highest recyclers per capita in the country, I think because we had that container deposit back in the 70s and the rest of the country's just caught
Yep.
up with that idea. So we sort of identify as recyclers. We've got really terrific composting regime where we take food waste and we can turn it into really high quality compost and back to farmers. So we've kind of reached a point where we've done a lot of really good things, but what is that next stage? And we're trying to shift from the idea of what was originally, avoiding putting landfill, increasing landfill, and diverting from that into, well, actually, we need a circular economy. So the new policy is asking the question of what does it mean to really be a circular economy where all waste is in fact resources and where, importantly, crucially, we don't create the product that's unnecessary in the first place. So the policy is trying to traverse that from whether we're talking about manufacturing or packaging or extended producer responsibility for those wicked items like lithium batteries
Yep.
that not only are wasteful but also can set fire to recycling and landfill places, which can be catastrophic. So it's really looking at all of those questions, and it's out for people to give us a bit of input on that.
This sounds good. And once again, it seems to be South Australia and New South Wales that are leading the way on that because New South Wales has just passed a product stewardship law, and hopefully we will see the federal government lift its game as well, because I think there's general agreement that federal waste legislation could do with a bit of an overhaul.
Well, and Penny Sharp is fabulous minister, can I say, and we've been watching very carefully that legislation because the intention is that we will come up with either exactly the same or a version that's required for our legislative environment. But we decided not to wait for the federal government, basically, and we'd all just start
Yes.
doing it. But New South Wales took the lead and they are wonderful.
Yes, that phrase, exactly the same, will cheer up a lot of businesses, I'm sure, in the waste
Yeah, exactly.
and
It would be easier, wouldn't
recycling
it?
sector.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Minister, thanks so much. I know you have to get back to work and I have to hit the highway and head to Perth.
Oh my goodness, well, safe travels. That's a long way to go.
Okay, now it's time to hit the highway to Perth, a trip of about 2,700 kilometres that takes us along the Great Australian Bight. And because it's whale migration season, I'm going to put a tape of humpback whale song in the cassette player while we travel along. Enjoy. Well, that was a long way, but here we are in downtown Perth. Now, if I had to come up with a phrase to sum up what's happening in Western Australia at the moment, it would be the scene of the crime. That's a reference to the state being home to Woodside's Northwest Shelf LNG project, which has just received a proposed federal approval to extend its operating life by 50 years to 2070. That's more than 20 years after the world is supposed to achieve net zero. In each of those 50 years, Woodside estimates its customers would release more than 80 million tonnes a year of greenhouse gas as a result of burning the Northwest Shelf extension fossil gas. There are also concerns about the impact of the extension on the extraordinary rock art of Murujuga, which includes the Burrup Peninsula. The proposed federal approval follows the granting of state government approval for the extension project back in December last year. But there are two court cases underway that are challenging the approvals. In one recently launched case, a group called Friends of Australian Rock Art has gone to the WA Supreme Court, arguing that the state government failed to fulfil its legal obligations when assessing the project. There is also a longer-standing traditional owner case in the federal court focused on cultural heritage protection, which dates from 2022. Hearings in that matter get underway this month. In other Western Australian environment news, iron ore and energy company Fortescue has asked the state's EPA to recommend approval for the construction and operation of a massive wind farm to provide renewable energy to its Pilbara mining operations. Fortescue's proposed East Pilbara generation hub would consist of up to 200 wind turbines with a total capacity of 2.1 gigawatts. Fortescue says the project would cut its operational greenhouse gas emissions by at least 1.5 million tonnes each year by replacing diesel and fossil gas-fired generation. Other Western Australian developments include the release of a report by the state's Auditor General, which concludes the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation is not doing anywhere near enough to monitor water use by licence holders. And it also concludes that the department isn't taking proper enforcement action. Depressingly, the Auditor General made similar findings in 2003 and 2009, and it seems nothing much has changed. Lastly, Western Australia is also the state where possibly the cheekiest bit of climate legislation has been put before Parliament. In a dig at the Labor government, Greens parliamentarian Brad Pettit has introduced a bill called the Climate Action This Decade Bill. The bill would provide for measures including a legislated target of net zero emissions by 2050, the setting of interim targets for 2030 onwards through to 2050, the development of an emissions reduction strategy, and the development of sector adaptation plans. It's a terrific bill, which is part of the reason that Brad Pettit has introduced it. The other reason he's introduced it is that he's rubbing Labor's face in it. That's because the bill is almost identical to a climate bill introduced by the Labor government in 2023, but Labor subsequently allowed it to lapse without steering it through Parliament. Now Brad Pettit has brought it back from the grave. I think in this case we can safely say that imitation isn't the sincerest form of flattery. Okay, now it's time to hit the highway and head for Darwin, our final stop. Here we are in Darwin, and the Northern Territory has introduced what I think is probably one of the worst pieces of legislation I've seen in a while. It's called the Territory Coordinator Bill, and it establishes a new office of the Territory Coordinator to handle the environmental assessments of big, complex projects. There's nothing wrong with having a coordinator for these projects, and Queensland has had one for quite a long time. But amazingly, the Northern Territory's new law allows the coordinator to recommend that the minister grant what are called exemption notices. These notices would allow environmental approvals to be issued even if they conflict with existing laws, including the Territory's Environment Protection Act and Heritage Act. That's an extraordinarily dangerous provision, which seems to set the fossil gas industry up to do what it likes, without having to bother about what existing laws say. The Territory Coordinator Law isn't the only backward step in the Northern Territory. The Territory government has also abandoned the target of generating 50% of its electricity from renewables by 2030. And it has abandoned the previous government's target of a 43% reduction in emissions by 2030, despite stating before last year's election that it was committed to that target. So that's a total of one bad law and two major climate target backdowns from the Territory government. It's not an inspiring way to end our road trip, but keep in mind that in the Northern Territory and right around Australia, there are people who are doing amazing things to help us achieve a cleaner, greener future. Okay, that's the end of our massive road trip. I really enjoyed having you along for the ride, and I hope you enjoyed it too. If you did, please rate the show on your favourite podcast platform and tell your colleagues about it. If you want to provide feedback or interview tips, you can reach me on murray@earthed.au. That's MURRAY at earthed, EARTHED.au. Track Changes is a labour of love at the moment, so please also reach out if you want to talk about sponsoring a few episodes. Now it's time for me to head out of Darwin and back to Melbourne. And don't worry, I'll stick to the Territory's 130 kilometres per hour speed limit. See you next time.